Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello and welcome back to Quills and Chills. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and today I am thrilled to welcome none other than Chuck Wendig. Chuck is a New York Times bestselling author. He is known for his gripping tales and unforgettable characters. He's got a long-ass list of credits, but today he is here to talk to me about his latest book, Monster Movie, which dives into the heart of horror for young adults. And it's also mixed with a bit of nostalgia, which I absolutely love, some suspense, and a lot of humor. So welcome to the show, Chuck.
Hey, thanks for having me. What's going on?
Before we get into this book, which I absolutely love, and I'll tell you why in a little bit, I want to know a little bit about you. So, give us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? How did you get into writing? Give us the background.
Well, I'm in Pennsylvania. Classically, if you're not from Pennsylvania, I will tell you I'm from Philadelphia, but about an hour north of Philadelphia in Bucks County. One of those like swing counties in the swing state kind of situation. So it's been a really interesting place here in the last several months. Yeah, writing, I've always, wanted to tell stories, and always, writing was always a part of what I did, writing and art. And it was really not until like junior high where I realized like, oh, this is like a job. Like people do this for money. It's not just a thing they do for giggles.
I can get paid for this? Yeah, man.
Yeah, that's pretty wild, because everyone's always asking you, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'm like, astronaut seems scary. And, oh, God, I don't know. So I don't have any other good answers for that. So writer felt like a pretty good answer. And at that point, I kind of wrote, more or less in earnest from that point forward. Not always successfully, as it turns out, because when you're young, you're like, I'm going to write the best story ever. And then you're like, this is actually absolute garbage. But you have to write the garbage to get to the good stuff. So it's just a lot of that kind of iteration and reiteration.
So, what's your process for writing? Are you somebody that just likes to jump in with both feet? Are you obsessively planning out every little detail? Or are you a little bit of both? How do you dive into it when you start?
I mean, probably a little bit of both now. Like I used to be, for my first published novel, Blackbirds On, I was a pretty diligent planner, outliner, because when I was writing books that weren't successful, writing those so-called trunk novels, like literally novels you should probably keep in a trunk 6 feet deep in the backyard. I did, of course, the thing that every unsuccessful novelist does, which was I thought I was going to be a screenwriter. So I entered a screenwriting contest, and the prize of which was a mentorship with a screenwriter guy named Steven Susko, who wrote the Grudge films, and I did a Jack Ketchum adaptation in high school and a few other things. And so I did win. I won the thing. And, like I met with him, and I was like, I don't really want to, I decided I don't really want to write screenplays. I want you to help me figure out this novel that I'm having a hard time writing. And like, I'm going to write that into a screenplay and then maybe use that as a bouncing, wall to get back to the novel. And he's like, well, sure, we can do that. I don't, it's your dime, man. So he was great. And he's like, the first thing we're going to do is outline. And I was like, no, I don't do that. That's not a thing. That's like, you guys in Hollywood land, you have to outline. Like here in novel world, I just like, what does like a pony say? Like what are the clouds talking about right now? That's what I want to do. I just want to see what's happening in my heart. And, of course, he's like, how's that going out for you? So I was like, yeah, that's not going well for me. I see your point. Let's try to outline. And so, it was like, that frozen or montage of like, punching frozen beef and running up a snowy mountain to write this outline. And I did it, and it sucked and I hated it, but it worked. And it like taught me that that's how I write. And then, of course, I internalized that process and assumed that that's always how I write. And then the biggest book I ever wrote, Wanderers, came along, this big, sprawling, very plotty book. And I didn't outline a word of it. I just kind of felt that I knew it, and I just started to write it, and it worked out pretty well. So I don't really outline anymore. So it was a weird, process is one of those things that can shift in a chameleonic sort of way.
I love that, and I feel that. I tend to think of myself more as a creative person, and so having to sit down and put things into a little graph or an outline or something, and like it needs to fit in all these little boxes. Just it makes me absolutely insane to have to do it. So
Yeah.
I feel your pain when it comes to that. What genres do you typically write in? Do you have a favorite? Are you strictly horror? I mean, what's your
I mean, I'm not strictly horror. In fact, up until recently, I wasn't technically horror at all because horror was kind of a big no in the whole, genre space. Like everyone's like, Blackbirds, I wrote because that's the funny thing is I really always wrote and read horror. Even when I wasn't writing horror, I had horror sort of injected into the work. But I remember that first book I wrote, Blackbirds, was for me it was a kind of a horror crime mashup. And the publisher was like, "We're calling it urban fantasy," and I was like, "But it is definitely not. Like, there's no urban, and there's very little fantasy. It's really horror." And they're like, "Yeah, urban fantasy." So it went out called that, and then they went bankrupt, and then another publisher, a bigger publisher, Simon & Schuster, picked it up, and they were like, "Oh, it's definitely not urban fantasy." I'm like, "I agree with you," and they're like, "So we're going to call it." The same thing that we call every Joe Hill novel. I was like, "Oh, so horror." And they're like, "Supernatural suspense." Joe Hill doesn't write horror. I'm like, I'm so pretty sure he writes horror. I feel like it's like it's in his literal blood is horror. And they were like, "Nah, we call it something different." So for a long time, like you weren't really allowed to quote unquote write horror, but horror is what is in my heart. Which sounds like a really dark way to put that. Horror is what I like to write from my heart. It's not like I live in a never-ending experience of horror in my mind.
Having been doing this show for a while now, while I do say it's based in horror, I do find myself coming up against it's supernatural horror,
Right.
or it's
Right.
haunted house horror. There's all these different sort of subgenres that sort of come along with it as well. Last question, and we'll dive right in. Do you have a favorite scary story from your childhood? This is always my favorite question.
Oh, like an urban legendy type of thing?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, there's so many. Like I live in a folklore rich area. And so, even like The Staircase in the Woods is just one of those things that's a book coming out for me, and that kind of is based on a thing that you can really find in the woods around here. There was one, it's not even from really when I was a kid, but I heard about it when I was a kid, but it became crystallized when I moved further up county for a little while. There's a mountain called Haycock Mountain, and people say like if you walk along the trails, you'll find that there's a greenhouse up there, and up in the greenhouse there's a bunch of albino cannibals, and if you like look at them, they don't want to be looked at or perceived in some way, and they will take you to the greenhouse and I guess eat you. I was like, man, that's just so weird. Like, what a weird thing.
It's very specific.
It's very specific. It's so specific. I'm like, well, that's real. Like, that's too specific. This isn't like a generic, like, ooh, there's like a monster or a hook hand man. It's like, no, they're albinos and also they're cannibals and it's a greenhouse. And you're like, what? Okay.
And I just look at them.
Just say that. Yeah.
I grew up in North Carolina. We have our own fair share of like haunted, scary stories and all kinds of things. So I think it's specific to every region. But yeah, when you grow up, in those folklore rich areas, you get a lot of great things to talk about, things to fuel the imagination, if you will. So,
word.
Well, let's talk about this book, shall we? Monster Movie. Let's start off with just tell us a little bit about what the story itself is about and the inspiration behind wanting to write it.
Monster Movie is about a kid, Ethan Petoskey, who his friends and his classmates are, while the parents are all away at a school event, they're going to have a party and watch what is supposed to be the scariest movie ever made. And Ethan's totally like, I'm not going. He's scared of everything. He's an anxious kid. So he refuses to go until he's kind of guilted into coming. So he shows up late. But by the time he shows up, it turns out that the monster movie is actually literally itself a monster. And so it begins attacking the other classmates, and spoiler warning, it eats literally all of their heads. And it's up to him to figure out how to deal with that situation, both how to escape and maybe how to save his classmates.
I love it. One of the things I do whenever I receive these books, they always come with like the summary sheet, the one sheets and all of that. And I always put the one sheet aside. I'm like, I don't want to know anything about the story. I want to go in cold. I want to go in fresh. And when everything started happening with the TV and all of that, I was like, okay, I'm in. I was like all night long I went with this book. It's great. So it's fantastic.
That's the dream.
I think one of the things I love the most about the story is kind of the setting and really about this nostalgia of that for me. And I think it's maybe it's because I grew up in a small town, but it just had that sort of small town nostalgic feel to me a little bit.
Sure.
And so I was wondering if you could talk about sort of what made you want to sort of set the story where it took place.
I felt like, like I grew up in a place that was initially very rural. And then over time through as I grew up, the area sort of grew up as well in a literal sense, it became more suburban than rural. And so, you know, I lived kind of on a farm, but then I had friends who lived in these like dense sort of neighborhoods that kind of, we were watching movies like what E.T. and Gremlins and Goonies. It's like, that kind of like small town sort of kids on bikes adjacent stuff. Now, obviously, you have Stranger Things, and I really just think that that's such a prime, fertile ground for creepy horror good times. It's not just necessarily like I'm in the woods or it's just like a haunted house, but like that small town feels safe. But like what happens when something terrible occurs to it? And then, it just felt like a kind of a place that I think most people in this country would recognize as sort of a development in neighborhoods like this one. So some of my books are very specifically set in a location. They're either a very Pennsylvania rich sort of area. Some of them are literally set, where I am now and where I grew up. But this one, I wanted to have it feel a little more, kind of could be anywhere in this country. And it could be like, this town, you've seen this town, you've been in this town, you maybe grew up in this town. And, these kids are all in some way, I think, familiar to most people.
That's what I loved about it. And there's a scene in the basement where they're all together sort of watching the movie, I believe. And I'm like, my God, I did that as well. So
Yep.
it was just a lot of moments throughout the story that I really kind of related to in a big, big way. So let's talk a little bit about the characters, especially the main characters, Ethan, Olivia, Harvey. Talk a little bit about sort of were there any challenges in sort of finding and developing their voices?
No, weirdly, some characters take a while to show up, some don't. These characters showed up pretty immediately with like just who they were and how they played off of each other. Trying to find that sort of like the dynamic between people and trying to like, find the friendship axis, right? Because like I always find that friend groups are fascinating to me because they're not like they don't just contain like one type of kid. You have kids who kind of come in at different angles, and in part because it's just necessity. Like you grew up together, or you grew up in the same neighborhood, or you're in the same class, or you like some of the same things, or you're simply just like herded in by proxy of being like, well, you were kind of the weirdos, and so you belong in this particular quadrant. And
yeah,
so
that was me.
yeah, that's me. Exactly. So, the kind of the freaks and geeks sort of model of things. And so just to find a way for these kids to bounce off of each other and their voices came pretty immediately onto the page. Harley was maybe the first one to really pop onto the page, just because sometimes characters like that they don't know what they're going to do, so you don't know what they're going to do, I think tend to be some of the most fun to write.
Definitely a fun ride for sure. What about the research process for this book? Did you because of the nostalgia of it, I feel like there's a sort of a classic horror film vibe that sort of weaves itself through it a little bit. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. Did you lean into watching old horror films? What was that process like for you?
I already kind of do. So it's like one of those things where
it's every day,
I'm a very lazy researcher. It's less that I go out and research the things that I'm writing, and more like I have been interested in a thing and have inadvertently researched a novel. And then all I have to do is sort of like smush it together, be like, here's the book. Some of this really comes from sort of my youth, right? Because you've got, like, when I was a kid, my sister told me, like, there's the scariest movie I've ever seen, and people are going to see it. It's The Exorcist. And she's like, people are going to see this movie, and they're fainting, and they're passing out, and they're having heart attacks, and they're throwing up. And you're like, oh my God, that's like terrible. So it was less about like what The Exorcist was even about did not register to me or matter. I didn't ask, well, what is it about? I was just like, well, horror movies are obviously terrible. They're clearly themselves malevolent entities here to mess with us. And so I would just avoid them as much as I can. So there just came this point where I knew I'm never going to watch horror movies. I'm never going to read horror. I'm never going to do any of that. And I went to a video store and I was like, I don't like horror movies. So you'd see that like one VHS rack of all of the bloody faces and the knife fingers. And you'd be like, I'm going to do the full circuit around the video store. and go to like sci-fi or something. And so I was like, it's cool. Like Star Wars is cool. And I like all the aliens in Star Wars. So here's a movie called Alien. So I'm just going to pick that up and take that home. And, I was like 10 years old or something like that. And no one no one when I was a kid cared about that. They weren't like, well, this is R, you can't watch this. My mother had no pop culture knowledge. So she was just like, yeah, whatever. And the guy behind the counter this wasn't even Blockbuster where they sort of had standards. This was like the local video store. So they didn't care. He was just a teenager. So I took that home and then I was like, and then, but it kind of like, it was like uncorking a bottle. I was like, oh, this is great. And I very much enjoyed this experience. And it turns out I didn't, vomit or die. So it feels like a good, like in that point, I was like, horror is cool. I was wrong. My sister lied to me. That's probably all nonsense.
It's funny you said that. I actually did have a comment about Alien because it is one of my favorite sort of franchises, but especially early on, the first and second one for sure.
Yeah.
And the first time I saw Alien, I remember, I don't know how old I was. I just remember it was like midnight or like in the middle of the night. And I'm at a friend's house and all of us are sitting in the living room. The lights are out. We're watching it. Suddenly I've got like 6 couch cushions around me. I'm like, what is happening? I can't, like, it scared the crap out of me, but I was hooked from that moment forward. So,
yep. Horror junkies.
Yep, exactly. I caught an interview with you in the Horn book, and in that you talked about how horror serves as sort of a safe version of exposure therapy.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I was like, God, I love that so much. I mean, it kind of is true. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and sort of how you balance fear and safety either in this story or just in general. I mean, I loved that comment.
Yeah, I think, both as readers and as writers, we kind of come to the page to grapple with sort of big stuff, like stuff we're worried about, stuff we love, stuff we're anxious about, stuff, we're uncertain about. And I think horror in particular is a great place to sort of do that ancient medieval summoner. Like I draw the chalk salt outline on the floor and I summon a demon into this space. And while he's in that space, I can ask it questions or I can make it do things for me. And it can't hurt me and I'm not going to hurt it. But we have this communication. And so I feel like, writing and reading, and again, especially crystallized in the horror context, is that summoning circle. That's like where you're grappling with some demons. And I think it's nice to do that. I think it's healthy to do that. And I think it's useful. I think it's one of the things where I think it was sad to me when horror did kind of fall away a little bit as a quote unquote genre, a real genre, because it's always there. And I think it's I think readers of horror and writers of horror tend to be some of the nicest people I've met. So I feel like maybe it really does work. You're maybe really getting some poison out in these pages.
It's funny you say that. Again, it's not about me, but I will quickly say years ago, I worked on a television show where we went to horror conventions and we went to movie sets and we talked to people behind the scenes. And some of the most interesting and nice and loveliest people I've ever met in my life played absolute monsters from hell in these movies. And it's just it's exactly what you say. It's like it's weird to sort of have that dynamic and to see that. And Freddy Krueger was one of those for me. It was to see this lovely amazing human doing this evil man. So it's great.
Yeah, I believe it.
So I think you also talked about, you previously discussed how horror sort of reflects on societal fears, and we were sort of diving into that a little bit here. I've always kind of said the same thing here. I always think that horror is always a mirror for society in a way. And I was wondering if you could talk about sort of how that, in relation to this book, how you sort of use that and how you also use humor, because I think you use humor a lot to sort of take some of the edge off of that.
Yeah, and humor has a weird value in that it, number one, takes the edge off, but number two, I also think it puts the edge on, right? Because like horror and, I mean, there's two things, right? Number one, that horror and humor contrast each other. So when you're, laughing and feeling comfortable, you're letting your guard down. It's that whole don't move and it won't hurt game. Like if I'm gonna hold you. And it's like, don't move and it won't hurt. But then as you kind of like don't move, they start to relinquish their grip. You're like, I got out. But that's like just as you sort of like, I'm going to take a breath here. This is a little funny. I'm relaxing. And then suddenly the horror kind of comes back. So you both have that sense of relaxation and an unspooling of tension, but it's also an opportunity for the blade to cut more quickly and more.
You don't see it coming.
Yeah, so it serves kind of a dual function there, both that I think it's just generally nice and fun to write that sort of thing, but also to, you know, give you more room to surprise people. And then also humor gives you the advantage of not having something be narratively monochromatic, right? Horror has the risk sometimes of being unrelentingly bleak and just sort of like it's dark, dour, dire stuff. And you're like, yeah, that's great. And I sometimes really like to read those types of things, but also like I kind of want the ups and downs of it. I want a little something else in there to make that work for me. And what was the other question about societal?
And horror in terms of like holding a mirror up to society and sort of how it reflects it can reflect who we are as a society sometimes.
Yeah, it can reflect it. It can reflect our fears of who we are as a society. I mean, the whole like zombie genre is a great example of that, in that, you know, in terms of evidence, generally speaking, we do not act like people do in zombie movies. Generally speaking, when under crisis, I mean, LA is, I think, a good example of this. When under crisis, communities tend to draw together. They don't fragment and turn to anarchy and chaos. That's not to say anarchy and chaos is impossible. Certainly it can be, and certainly that happens. But in zombie films, instantly, like the zombies are always a environmental danger. The zombies are the flood. They're a hurricane. They're personality-free masses of danger. They're just as bad as a tsunami coming toward you. That's really all. They're just more bloody and with eyes popping out. And so the danger in a zombie movie is always like, well, am I going to try to get, you know, reach up to have someone carry me up and they're going to kick me down to the ground. And so I get mobbed by them. Like, and then they become part of the environmental disaster. So people are really like the problem in zombie films, but that's not typically true, but it's how we feel. And it's what we worry about. And so zombie films have an opportunity to grapple with how we feel about people and what we think about people. So, and certainly with monster movie, you know, the thing is like, are our movies and is our media harming our kids? And sort of like, obviously I don't think so. And I'm not saying so with this book, but like, it does grapple with that idea of like, what happens when something gets out of your control and the thing you are scared of is the thing that you should be scared of. Like, it's not just like it's an empty fear, but then you still have to conquer a real thing. And to see sort of where that takes you as both a kid and a reader and so forth.
So without spoilers, I want to know what your favorite moment or your favorite scene in this book is, and what you think the reader should look forward to. Before you answer that, though, I'm going to tell you mine. I have two.
Okay. Right.
So the first one, and I'm going to be very vague about this because if I say who it is, I think it's a spoiler. So I'm just going to say the villain monologue that comes into that to me is absolutely. I actually took it and wrote it down because I'm like, this is just so good. I love it. So that is one of my favorite parts of the whole book. I think that's something to look forward to, and I think it's page 172. I will tell you that. So, and then the second one is the post-credit scene. Just because it exists. I absolutely love it because we are in a world these days where we always have that post-credit scene at the end of most movies. And the fact that you did it, I just loved it, and sort of where you left the story. So those are my two favorites. What's yours?
Oh, that's a good question. There's a scene at the school when they go to the school to try to grapple with like, our parents are there. So obviously the parents are going to help us. And I didn't want to do the thing where, you know, in Stephen King's A, where the parents are literally like a liability to you, like they are actually probably cumulatively part of the evil you're trying to fight. But I did want to take them off the table in terms of like, well, I just got to go find mom and dad and everything's going to be great. It's like you find mom and dad and then there's the classroom, because everyone's got the smart boards now. And I was like, what if the smart boards are a TV on which a horror movie can appear and start trying to eat people's heads off? And I was like, that feels good to me. That feels particularly making this thing that everyone sees in their classroom be super scary and weird.
I loved it. That's another great scene I actually really loved too. So lastly, are there any tropes or themes you'd like to explore further in future books that you haven't done so far?
Man, I am hankering to write a proper vampire novel. I mean, I wrote what was technically a work for hire book called Double Dead. Basically, the publisher was like, oh, just we make zombie novels, so pitch us a zombie novel. And then unfortunately, they kind of owned it. It was not a great deal on my behalf. But I was like, well, what happens if a vampire wakes up in a zombie apocalypse? And so I wrote that, and it was a lot of fun to write. But I really, at this point, would love to, like, Black River Orchard for me was by proxy kind of a vampire novel, in that these people become obsessed with this apple, and when they bite the apple, they become stronger, better versions of themselves, and they become hungrier and hungrier for the apple, and it starts to change them, and they start to become more callous, narcissistic, egotistical versions of themselves. So in effect, they were kind of becoming vampire-like, even though there was not the standard trappings for vampires. But that being said, like, I would love to just write a down and dirty 100% straight up vampire novel. So I haven't figured out the angle for that one yet, but I'm working on a demon book right now. So maybe after I'm done with that, I'll get there.
I love it. I'm very excited for all of that. Is there anything else in the world of monster movie that you might revisit, especially with that end credit scene, that post credit scene?
I don't think so. I think this is one I would love to. I think it's done and over. Though I never say never. If there's more story there that I can find, and also there's a readership there for it, I would certainly tell that story. Dustin Grimm is one that I feel like needs more story. So let's see if I can convince the publisher to bite on that one. But so far, I think monster movie is where it's at. So we'll see.
Perfect. Well, Chuck, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for talking to me today. And I just want to say a real big shout out to your mom and to that kid behind the counter for letting you rent Alien, because again, like I said, I totally relate. So very much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
You got it. The book is called Monster Movie. It's available everywhere now. And as we always like to say here, please support your local bookstores whenever possible. So, Chuck, how can our audience find you online?
Yeah, I just stalk the digital hallways like a weird little goblin. No, terribleminds.com is always the cleanest, easiest way to find me. That's my blog, and certainly I'll talk about what I'm doing there and books I'm writing. But I'm on Bluesky too, and Instagram, and
Great. I'll get those all added to. I'll get them to the show notes, and I'll also put them up on screen for the video version as well.
Thank you.
So, once again, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
The rest of you, we'll see you next time on Quills and Chills.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review, because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.